Look at this image. When you see it, what word comes to mind? The first you probably thought of was propaganda. Today, propaganda is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but the literal definition is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a particular cause, doctrine, or point of view. Propaganda has basically been used as long as organized civilization has been a thing. The United States is no exception. Despite our nation being relatively young compared to most other countries, we have a wealthy history of using our popular relevant media to mislead our own citizens and indoctrinate them to our form of belief. This is going to be a history of the U.S.'s use of propaganda from the birth of our nation to today. I feel like this is an important subject now more than ever due to the rise of massive news networks, social media, and algorithms that are constantly vying for your attention and by making you perpetually paranoid about your own neighbors. This is how people get you to think and act how they want. They make you afraid and angry. It's constantly used against us and is hurting this country's relationship with itself, and it has been for centuries. This works for everything from clickbait to cults, and it really does work for the US government. So first things first, we're going to look at what was used for the Revolutionary War. Okay, so a common theme in this video is going to be that a lot of propaganda came about due to war, but keep in mind that there is plenty of other propaganda from these time periods. This will just make everything a lot easier to digest, trust me. So the first experiences that our country ever had with propaganda came from the Revolutionary War, and that makes sense. It's hard to fight against the mightiest military power in the world if people don't know about your cause and why they should want to fight for it. These posters are very interesting, though. They were also used before the war technically started as a way to get people to agree with policies like no taxation without representation, which was what it was about before independence became the main goal of the colonists. They often use symbolic imagery to show very complicated topics in a way that the masses could understand. Like this one, it's pretty grisly. Showing a woman who has been dismembered with the initials of different states engraved on her arms. Benjamin Franklin actually made this one. He made it to show the power of the 13 colonies during their series of boycotts of British goods because of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a steep, unfair taxation policy that the British put on the colonies in order to recuperate money after being drowned in debt due to their wars with the French, and the colonies were very upset because they were not represented in Parliament and couldn't defend themselves. Their boycotts severely damaged the British economy, which is why Franklin depicted Britannia as a dismembered woman who had amputated her own extremities by alienating her colonies and was now crippled because of it. Franklin made this little piece of propaganda in order to convince Britain to repeal the Stamp Act, but as you can tell from the everything about America, it did not work very well. During the Revolutionary War, more propaganda was made, most of which was trying to convince colonists to join the rebels and fight for freedom. One of the most famous pieces was an engraving made by Paul Revere. Yes, that one. In it, he depicts the events of the Boston Massacre, and there are so many things wrong with this. First of all, the way he depicts the event is a bit misleading. I'm not saying that the British did the right thing by shooting at a crowd full of unarmed people, but the people who were shot at were not... They were basically rioting. The people who were there were antagonizing the British by throwing snowballs, which turned into rocks, which turned into oyster shells at army soldiers, which would be the equivalent of throwing a rock at a cop car and expecting nothing bad to happen to you. Again, I'm not saying the British were in the right, I'm just saying that the way this is depicted is pretty not factually correct. But the way this is depicted, if you had never heard about the Boston Massacre at this time period and you saw this, you would assume that this was a crowd of innocents that were just randomly shot by a group of redcoats. And that's the big problem with propaganda. At its core, it is misleading. So, next up on the chopping block of US history, we have the Civil War. Yeah, that was a messy time. One of the big things I need you to keep in mind about the Civil War is that at the beginning, the war was not about slavery. It was about the preservation of the Union. You can see that with the propaganda during certain periods of the Civil War. This whole emancipation thing did not become a selling point until Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. A proclamation which he only signed to make sure that European countries did not become involved on the side of the South because we were making them lose their supply of Southern cotton. Abraham Lincoln has been on record to say that if he could free every slave to save the Union, he would. But also, if he had to keep every slave a slave to save the Union, he would do that too. This was not about the slaves originally, it was about the Union. So after that whole bunny trail, this piece of propaganda from the South, you can see that the Southern leaders are doing their best to make it seem that they are fighting for a noble cause by showing some decorated soldier looking towards the heavens with a huge flag that says, "God save the South." Of course, I don't think that God would be very happy with the millions of slaves, but we don't need to talk about that. Obviously, this is a very misleading about the actual institution that the South was built on and the aggression that the South was showing against their own nation. The war started with a Southern attack on Fort Sumter, which was basically an act of domestic terrorism. Now, of course, the North wasn't perfect either. They weren't like, oh, look at all those poor people in the South that they're keeping enslaved. They were more like, oh no, they're breaking apart the Union, it'll shatter the economy and make us internationally vulnerable. I'm not saying that there weren't any Northerners that knew that slavery was a moral evil. I'm just saying that across the board, that was not the reason that they were going to war. Take this postcard for the Union, for example. It literally spells it all out. It's a war for the Union. Slaves only became a big factor when Abraham Lincoln decided they needed a way to make sure they could keep Europe from helping the South. That is why the war was given a moral reason. Don't get me wrong, it is obvious from accounts of Lincoln that he believed that slavery was wrong, but most people forget that he cared more about the Union than freeing the slaves. There's also several pieces of propaganda made by the North after the war was given a moral reason, denouncing the South for the institution of slavery, like the satirical flyer. This one is making fun of the South for pretending that their arguments for slavery were eloquent. This propaganda, while helpful making sure the Union stayed together and was making slavery internationally, abhorred by all people, it also misleads people about what the war was fought for. It was not mainly fought for human rights, it was fought for the sake of economic and national stability. Next up is World War I. This period of history easily provided us with the most iconic example of military recruitment propaganda in history, the easily recognizable Uncle Sam "We Want You" poster. What this poster doesn't mention, of course, is the extreme physical, mental, and emotional nightmare that war is for a human being. You have to remember that this is a time period before distrust of the government was a norm. That started with the Cold War, and don't worry, we will get into that. I want you to think about it for yourself, but for me, this kind of military enlistment really bothers me on a personal level. Something about it just feels really dishonest about what war truly is. I don't know, but you should really come up with your own idea. I'm just here to inform you. I don't want this to be a piece of propaganda. Just think about it for yourself, please. Now it's time for World War II. This is when I feel that United States propaganda gets to a new level of manipulative. It didn't just convince people to go to war, it convinced people to judge their neighbors and distrust them based on how they look, and with some disastrous consequences. First, we got the standard fare, racism. Whole lot of racism. Okay, am I insane, or does it feel like American propaganda reached an apex of racism with this? And this is after the Civil War. So apart from the elephant in the room of how these leaders are drawn, there is obviously just a call to arms here for factory workers to up production. After Pearl Harbor, we joined the war and just kind of worked our way out of the Great Depression. It's actually really interesting how economically profitable World War II was for the United States, but that is not what this is about. That's a whole other can of worms. It starts to get a little more concerning with this one, "Loose talk can cost lives." It was a very popular propaganda slogan that was used by the US and Great Britain during World War II, and it was basically a way of warning citizens not to talk about military activity out of fear that it might slip into the hands of the enemy and be used against them. And this is one of the less upsetting of these posters. Most of them include imagery of sinking ships and dead soldiers. Obviously, this stirred up a lot of distrust and paranoia in the minds of the American people. This made them afraid that anyone they talked to could be an enemy. It also made it easier for the government to cover up any failings or missteps it took during the war. It quite literally made it unpatriotic to talk about the activities of the military. It let the government really control what people knew about the war. It was used to keep up morale, but it also misled Americans during a very crucial point in their lives. Not only that, but they were stirring up distress by making it seem that espionage and enemies on the inside were, like, a constant looming threat. Okay, now it's time for a segment that I like to call Sentences You Never Thought You'd Hear. Here goes! Dr. Seuss made propaganda posters to make Americans distrustful of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, and he was one of many propaganda machines that made the government able to reach the apex of putting Japanese Americans in literal prison camps. Yeah, I'm being 100% serious. This propaganda flyer, made on February 13th, 1942 by Mr. Theodore Seuss Geisel himself. Yeah, it's definitely not one of those things that Dr. Seuss Enterprises would want you to know about. There are so many things bad about this one. Just glossing past the racist portrayals of Japanese people in this. This was made after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which was a mass surprise attack on America, which was orchestrated by the Japanese military. An unfortunate side effect of this attack is that the American government began to distrust citizens that were of Japanese descent, specifically Japanese immigrants. A fear that the government was that some of these citizens were Japanese spies that could help Japan attack America again. And unfortunately, the government thought that the only way to deal with this imagined threat was to imprison US citizens that happened to be of Japanese descent. And they hired people like Dr. Seuss to make this propaganda. Propaganda didn't just stir up fear and paranoia, it didn't just make people suspicious of those around them. It didn't only encourage just terrible thoughts about other people. It literally was used as an excuse to violate people's rights to autonomy and basic freedoms. This is what happens when propaganda gets pushed to logical extremes, and this is one of the better cases. Okay, let's do this. Out of any time in history, this is probably the one you think of the most when you hear the word propaganda, and that is for a very good reason. The Cold War is a very interesting time in US history because it's a time of extreme propaganda, but it's also the same time that the average American began to trust the government less and less due to conflicts like the Vietnam, Korean Wars, and the Pentagon Papers, and multiple other political scandals that really just smeared the government's reputation. So to start things off, we have this piece of propaganda. This was a very ideological-based war of capitalism against communism, so this makes sense. This is standard propaganda. It demonizes Russians, conveying them as brutish people who would strangle women. I don't agree with communism at all. I think it's very flawed, and it could never feasibly work. But I feel making it seem like every Russian would choke out a woman and punch a guy is, like, a bit much. It also makes the idea of quote-unquote life under communism seem like literal hell with the flames everywhere. And let me be clear, I'm not trying to say that life under communism and the Soviet Union is a good thing at all. Like, it sucked over there. But this just shows how the government used propaganda to get us to be afraid without actually critically thinking about what the situation actually is. Okay, I just want this to be clear. This second one was just really funny to me. Okay. This is a movie poster for a movie called I Married a Communist. This movie is about a shipping executive that is blackmailed by communists who want him to orchestrate a labor strike on a pier. It's just a classic early McCarthyism propaganda piece. It depicts the villains of the story, the communists, as almost mob-like figures. I feel like this premise would have worked better as a mafia movie, but the movie's whole purpose was to convince people that Russian communists are inherently evil people, so that just makes sense. You get what you get with this one. Alrighty, well that was a lot. But hopefully after this rocky history, seeing the people who have suffered because of it and the distrust it creates, propaganda must be a thing of the past, right? Right? Yeah, I should have known. We never learn. Okay, so if you pay attention to any modern mainstream news station, you will probably immediately notice that there are some odd things that are there for what is supposed to be classified as news. One thing that the president does can be very differently covered by two different news stations, namely CNN and Fox News, who are the two biggest ones and most politically different. Take our current president, as of making this video, Donald Trump, for example. Donald Trump is massively deporting illegal immigrants from the United States back to their countries of origin. And if you watch CNN, you will hear nothing but of how evil this is and how these people's rights are being violated. But if you watch Fox News, then you would only hear about how this is a great thing and how all these people being deported are dangerous criminals. There may be certain things about both statements that are right, but this isn't actually news. It all just depends on the one doing it. And they're not only there to educate the masses, but to persuade them. And it's a pretty shady and hypocritical means, because it really only matters with who is doing the thing. Here's an example. During the Obama administration, when Barack Obama deported over 3 million illegal immigrants, news outlets like CNN praised the Democratic president for cracking down on illegal immigration, a practice they today seem to think is a massive moral evil. Fox was, on the other hand, saying how unfair it was that Obama was deporting all these illegal immigrants based on things like traffic stops and DUIs, which was how they were discovered and later deported. Fox even called Obama the deporter-in-chief, which is odd because today Fox is rallying behind this mass deportation of illegal immigrants. Are you seeing what I mean here? Today we are in a new age of social media and televised content, and propaganda is now harder to spot than ever before because there isn't a little message on the bottom of a poster telling it was made by a certain party. It isn't a colorful or comedic image or slogan. It sometimes is, but most of the time it isn't. It's even more dangerous at any other point in history than it was because it's intermingled with what we rely on to know what's happening in the world. The goal of these parties is to make you despise the other to get your attention, your loyalty, and most importantly, your vote. That's the root of propaganda. It's us versus them. They're the idiots. They're the bad guys. We're good, so don't listen to anything they say. That's how it's been since the beginning of America. It's gone from colonies versus the British, United States versus the communists, and now United States versus United States. I have made this project for my APUSH history class because I believe that this is one of the biggest issues in America today. People are scared, distrustful, and unwilling to listen to each other, and it's the fault of propaganda from both sides. Neither is better than the other. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this will make you think a little harder about anything that you consume from either side. Thank you.